going to do is we're going to walk through this presentation you see on the screen. It's going to take us something like 20 minutes. It is only a summary of the second issue of the Grid Parity Monitor we have just released, but that summarizes the key findings of this second issue of this series of analysis. The first part is going to, I'm going to take care of it, and the second part, my colleague Maria Jesus, which is sitting next to me, will take care of it. First, a couple of slides about Clarion. For those of you who don't know the company, we are a strategy consulting company with a full focus on the new energy fields. That includes energy efficiency, smart grids, and renewable energy, all technologies. For these areas, we perform analysis in the areas of policy consulting, strategy consulting, financial advisory or M&A, and some market reports like the one we are presenting today. This is an overview of the geographic set of Clarion. We have two main offices in Madrid and Berlin. And we have partner offices with long-time companies or partners in those cities marked with a blue dot, essentially in Milan, in New Delhi, in India, in Washington, D.C., in Bogotá, Colombia, in Sao Paulo, in Brazil, and in Santiago de Chile, in Chile. Well, now going to the body of the study, essentially the whole study is based on the assumption of what we understand with grid parity. Essentially what we do in the report is comparing the cost of generating electricity with a PV system in a dwelling, for a residential consumer, and we compare that cost which we call LCOE, or levelized cost of electricity, and the cost of electricity provided by the local utility. So essentially the cost of local tariffs for residential consumers. In this report we have used a system of very quickly about the report, we think the Grid Parity Monitor is one of the most complete and comprehensive analyses in the PV industry about the grid parity arrival. This issue is about residential consumers, so as I said, we used 3 kilowatts PV systems. The geographic reach of this analysis is 5 markets in Europe, which is France, Germany, Italy, UK, and Spain, and 3 in Latin America, which is Brazil, Chile, and Mexico, and then also California in the US and Australia. This analysis, we used a very rigorous methodology and transparent, which is clearly explained in the second part of the report that you could see from page 40 on. Excuse me, from page 50 on, and we have used real data for each country and sometimes for each city. So we are not using assumptions or hypotheses, but real data when possible. That includes, of course, the cost of installing PV systems in all cities analyzed, which are 19 cities worldwide, and also includes real data from electricity costs from each local utility in each of the countries analyzed, sorry, in each of the cities analyzed. The report is for free, everybody can download it, and it is going to be a recurrent analysis, which means that we are going to update the information and the inputs every year at least, and sometimes every 6 months. This is, by the way, the second issue of the first analysis of this series. which is focusing on the residential sector. We are going to do also reports about the commercial sector, which will analyze systems of 30 kilowatts for small businesses, restaurants, hotels, etc. And this is we are preparing it now, and it will be ready in September. The report has been sponsored by these companies, Yingli Solar and Gesternova, and as a gold sponsor, Q-Cells, which are companies that most of you would know. We also have to thank very much the support of the European Copper Institute, of the Copper Alliance, and our technical partners, 3Tier and SunPower. And we also had the collaboration of PV associations in Chile, in Mexico, in Spain, in Australia, in France, and in the UK. Well, this first a few slides to explain a little bit more the methodological framework. Essentially, we used what we call the level S cost of electricity, which is a number, essentially, calculated how in the way we show in the formula in the slide. So essentially, this generates a cost, a price or a cost for the electricity the PV system generates, and it levelizes it for the entire lifetime of the system. That means that investment costs, which are shown on the excuse me, I'm trying to use the, here we go. The cost of investments, the capex, is shown over here in this bar. It means essentially that in year one there is a big investment to build the PV system, and then over time there are some O&M costs or operational costs which are also taken into account in this formula. And all that, the formula is over here. All that is collapsed into a single indicator, which is the level S cost of electricity, which is a price per kilowatt hour produced by the system during the lifetime of the investment. Something important to remark is that we are going to measure the level S cost of electricity of a system which is built in a certain point in time. So essentially, the case of a specific PV system would be shown below, which means a system which is built, for example, in first half of 2012 has a flat LCOE, as we can see in the brown line. Okay, but the cost of the electricity is expected to increase over the lifetime of this PV system. So in this case, we assume that the PV system will have a lifetime of 30 years, as we show in the axis below. And over here we see how in each year over the investment, we can compare the cost of let's say, PV electricity with the cost of electricity bought from the grid or from the utility. This, of course, is something different than having a general overview of the PV industry, where we will see that the LCOE is going to reduce over time as the cost of investment is reduced. But of course, this is an overall overview of the PV market, and is not the example of a specific PV system. This is something that anybody working in this industry is something clear and evident, but if some of you is not familiar with this industry and with these investments, then it could be an interesting clarification. This matrix is gives an overview of the main results of this second issue of the Grid Parity Monitor. So essentially, we have compared where each country is standing compared to the other, taking or analyzing these two variables. The grid over here is the grid parity proximity. There's something wrong with the screen, I think, because I can see all the letters. But anyway, this should be the grid parity proximity in this axis. And down here in this axis, we are representing how good the regulatory support to PV self-consumption is in each of the countries. So essentially, what we see is that Spain, Australia, Italy, and Mexico have the best grid parity conditions of the countries analyzed, while Mexico, California, and Brazil have the most appealing and most convenient regulatory systems or net metering systems for residential PV systems. So these countries over here would be the most attractive ones to generate a PV market based on the existence of grid parity. This, of course, is something that all PV players should take into account when designing or when thinking about their commercial strategy. Because even if there could be other elements impacting the generation or not generation of a PV market, the example, for example, of Mexico, we know the fundamentals over here are very good because of what we explained. As sooner or later, a market is going to be generated for PV systems in the residential segments. Right, and now we're going to start with an overview country by country. We are not going to talk about all countries we analyzed during the report, but only a selection of them. And Maria Jesus, my colleague, will do that. Thank you very much.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. As you can see in this slide, which illustrates Australia's case, grid parity has already been reached in this market. This arises mainly because of two factors. Firstly, the important decrease experienced by the LCOE in the last few years, mainly driven by PV system installation costs, which decreased significantly. And this is added to the great increase in retail electricity prices, which, as you can see in the graph on the left, for the standard tariff, it's estimated at 18.5% of compound annual growth rate. In terms of the regulatory framework in this market, we have evaluated it with 3 sons out of 4, because the net metering in New South Wales fosters the self-consumption market, as the tariff received for the exported PV generated electricity that is exported to the grid is lower than the grid electricity price paid to the utility. So passing on to the next case, which is Brazil, you can see we have analyzed 2 cities, Sao Paulo and Itacarambi. In both cases, you can notice that in the last month, the standard tariff from the grid has experienced a decrease. This is due to the fact that the government has introduced has forced these decreases in the market, and this results in this pushes PV grid parity further away in both cities. However, in Itacarambi, PV grid parity is much closer than in Sao Paulo. Anyway, it is relevant to highlight the important decrease in PV system price, which drives PV LCOE in both cities, overall in the country. These are estimated at more than 20% compound annual growth rate. In terms of the regulatory framework in Brazil, the recently approved net metering regulation is an excellent instrument to foster the auto-consumption market, but it might be too early to make this assessment. So we'll tell if this will be. We have evaluated the regulatory support with 4 out of 4 because less electricity, which is exported to the grid, is valued at the same cost as electricity from the utility grid. Passing on to Chile, we can see that both in Santiago as in Copiapó, the 2 cities we have analyzed, PV LCOE is already competitive against some of the utility electricity tariffs in the market. In the case of Santiago, this is only the case for the winter tariff. Here, as you can see in the upper graph, the tariff charged in winter is already higher than the most competitive LCOE we have calculated. In contrast, in Copiapó, a northern city, the standard tariff, the everyday tariff of a residential consumer in this city is already competitive against many of the most competitive LCOE and prices which are used as inputs in the lower range LCOE. In terms of the regulation, a net billing regulation has been recently passed in the country, but we are awaiting for the technical code to be published in order to make a thorough assessment of this regulation. At first sight, it's an excellent instrument to foster the auto-consumption market. And we have assessed it with 3 cents out of 4 because the excess PV electricity exported to the grid is valued at a price which is lower than the electricity bought from the utility. In Mexico, this is a very interesting case because there is a segment within the residential consumers which is called the DAC segment, which stands for Domésticos de Alto Consumo, an acronym in Spanish, which means residential consumers with high consumption. They pay significantly more than what the majority of the residential consumers pay in the market. This is why for this segment, which is estimated at about 500,000 potential clients market, it is already more convenient to generate their own electricity with their PV system and self-consume this self-generated electricity rather than buy it from the electricity grid. In contrast, for the great majority of the residential consumers who pay a standard tariff which is much lower than the DAC tariff, grid parity, proximity, it's not. It is still far from being reached. It should be noted that these tariffs are an average of the period. I mean, this standard tariff is the average of what consumers pay in this particular period, because there are several tariffs in this market. In Mexico, there is a net metering regulation called the Medición Neta regulation that already allows auto consumers to export the excess generation to the grid and obtain credits in return. Also, in multifamily houses, they can install a PV system and share the consumption between the different dwellings in that given building. This regulation is being given 4 cents out of 4. In Spain, PV grid parity has already been reached, both in Madrid as in Las Palmas. Here we have depicted the standard tariff as well as the peak tariff and the off-peak tariff. Both the standard tariff in both cities is already higher than the cost of generating 1 kilowatt hour of PV electricity with our residential. So grid parity has been reached. However, it is essential that the Spanish government publishes the net metering regulation in order to enable these consumers to be able to export to the grid their generation, and in this way value this generation. If it is nowadays that there's no regulation in place, the market is not developing. So that's the barrier we find in. So given that there is a lack of regulatory support for the auto consumption market, we have valued with the poorest grade, which is 1 out of 4. In Germany, despite its low irradiation levels, PV grid parity has already been reached in Munich, and it is very close to being reached in Berlin. The peak tariff in Berlin is already competitive with the most competitive LCOE and installation price calculated. On the other hand, in Munich, the standard tariff already competes with the PV electricity. In terms of the regulation, the renewable energies regulation in Germany fosters the self-consumption market in an efficient way, because the value of the exported PV-generated electricity is lower than what the electricity from the grid costs for a residential consumption. Therefore, it is more convenient, it is always more convenient for a self-consumer to immediately self-consume as much as possible of its generated electricity, either than export it to the grid. Well, this regulation was given 3 out of 4. Well, the main conclusions of this study is that almost every country improved its parity situation with respect to the second half of 2012, which is the period when we last analyzed PV grid parity proximity. This is mainly due to the reduction of the LCOE caused by the decrease in the cost of PV systems, driven mainly by the lower equipment price and an increased competition in emerging markets such as Brazil, Chile, or Mexico. The results of all of the markets analyzed, which are in the last issue are published in full and with thorough explanations, the document that is published in Leonardo Energy's webpage. We highlight here the case of Copia Point, Chile, and the segment of DAC consumers in Mexico that have definitely reached grid parity proximity, and where it is able to find a consumption market, or if it is not in place at the moment, it is sensible to think it will be soon developed. Even if grid parity, defined at the moment as LCOE equals retail electricity prices, has been reached, regulatory cover is still necessary to foster the consumption market. In this sense, we have argued the Spanish case, where although grid parity has been reached, but with no governmental support, the market has failed to develop. Lastly, as 100% self-consumption is likely to happen for residential consumer, a proper valuation of this excess electricity has to be performed to properly understand the business case of a consumer. You can find our analysis at Leonardo Energy's webpage and Iclarion's webpage. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for this comprehensive presentation. So now we can go ahead with the questions and answer session. So I would invite the audience to submit your questions. In the meanwhile, I think we have some initial remarks, so let's probably proceed with them one by one. So yes, the presentation will be available in the website of Leonardo Energy. You will be notified by email once everything is ready. There is a question relative to China and Japan, whether I suppose whether there is an assessment on grid parity. So for the time being, this analysis covers 10 countries, which are indicated in the study, but China and Japan are not being analyzed. Maybe the speakers have some additional elements to comment.
Yeah, in terms of Japan, what I can say is that as a result of Fukushima's disaster, the regulation it fosters the installation of PV systems in residential houses, and also the segment is already quite developed. We haven't studied in detail neither China nor Japan, but it would be interesting to include this market, perhaps some next issue, because both could represent potential markets for many of the interested parties here today, and also because in terms of pricing and the particular situations of both markets, perhaps the results would be especially interesting.
Okay, thank you. There is another question. In page 12, why some countries like France or Chile are longer than the other in the graphic? So let me switch to the presentation.
Yes, I think I understand already. This is simply because the prices we received from the installers in that country show a wider range. And also because the radiation in the country is more diverse. I mean, for example, in France, we have a very wide range because the north of France, over here I think we took Paris, and the south we took Marseille. The difference in radiation, I mean, the sun they receive is very big. I mean, they are not, I mean, in Paris there is very little sun, and in Marseille there is quite a lot of sun. This is what makes the range. For example, Chile is the same story. Chile is a very, let's say, long country from north to south, and the difference in hours of sun is very, the difference is very wide. That's the reason.
Okay, thank you for this clarification. Okay, so let's go for the next question. Dear Maria Jesus, considering that Brazil net metering compensation rates change for different states and different utilities, how will be the methodology for you to compare the PV grid parity? So I believe you only consider a couple of cities, so this probably explains part of the question, but I leave, of course, speakers to go ahead with the answer.
Interesting question. Actually, in our analysis, we in the PDF complete version, we explain that we are not including any external incentive such as net metering compensation in our analysis. It is purely PV technology against grid. Therefore, any subsidies or any tax advantages or any net metering compensation is considered in our financial model.
Okay, thank you.
And we didn't do it simply because that would make much more complex the analysis. And probably we'll need to go on a one-by-one cases, thinking about every single, for example, state or every single city or every single even consumer, and that would make things more difficult to make it comparable.
One key assumption in our analysis is that 100% of the PV generated electricity is self-consumed immediately. So no net metering tariffs or compensations are accounted for.
Okay, good. Thank you. Another question, can you say a bit more about the tough process to select regulatory environment specifically for self-consumption as a metric? An alternative would be to look at profitability given the export components in feed-in tariffs.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Fernando, if we could show the report, I mean the Word document, that would help.
Sure. One moment, please. Here you are, so please just dial the page you need to show.
Okay, over here we see the assessment we made of the regulatory schemes in each country. So essentially, we gave these sums and we made a scale of 4 categories: very poor, poor, good, and excellent. And over here we explain what very poor, poor, good, and excellent means. So essentially, this is of course a matter of judgment and is a qualitative assessment. Of course, somebody could argue that this a specific regulatory support scheme is better than another one, and is not but it is in the same category. Well, at the end, we had to make an overall judgment and generate categories that we think pretty much reflects what happens in reality. So essentially, whether a proper net metering system with a proper evaluation of the excess of electricity exists, then we thought that that was good. When this is not happening, then we thought it's not good. Well, I mean, we could get into the details, but I think I hope this answers already the question.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's go for next questions. What will be the influence of increasing importing taxes of PV equipment from China? Well,
the consequence most probably would be, I mean, everybody expects a slight increase in the cost of equipment in Europe. So if that happens, a higher cost of equipment will imply higher LCOE, and that would be bad for grid parity. So essentially, that will be shown as if we can, Fernando, go back to the presentation, that will be represented in the charts. The PowerPoint, please. So in the charts, we would see that the brown band, let's see, over here, these bands, if that happens, these brown bands, instead of decrease, we would see like an increase along over here. So essentially, the two lines will be far from each other and would be bad for grid parity. That would be the consequence, or at least the main consequence.
Okay, thank you very much. Interesting. Let's go ahead with other questions.
Actually, excuse me, just to add a little bit more about this last question. That's something that we are already seeing in countries like Brazil. Brazil is quite protectionist, and there are high import taxes for all PV equipment, and that is one of the reasons why LCOE is, let's say, relatively high compared to other countries where free trade exists.
So next question is, how and where does Africa stand? Secondly, is grid parity applicable or feasible in an off-grid system?
Well, Africa doesn't stand anywhere in our study because we didn't cover it, essentially. If we, Fernando, we go back to the presentation, please. Probably, let's say a country, if we pay attention to these metrics, if we look at a country with high electricity prices but very poor net metering system, probably it would be somewhere around here. Sorry, excuse me. The arrow. Here we go. Somewhere around here, roughly. Because we would expect that African countries don't have developed regulatory support for self-consumption, but I would expect that electricity costs are relatively high. And regarding off-grid, I think, I mean, the regulatory support is not relevant because there is no contact with the grid, therefore it wouldn't be a regulated market. And but I think grid parity would be relevant still for an off-grid system, because you could compare the cost of PV electricity to the cost of any other source of energy, like, for example, a diesel generator, or for example, building an electric line to the grid, or other alternatives.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go for another question. So, regarding Mexico, does the upcoming energy reform could change the PV grid parity scenario for the fourth quarter of 2013?
Well, we don't know in detail this reform, so we wouldn't be in a position to tell, but I suppose it could, very much. I mean, we need to think that the scenario we depict in all countries are profoundly impacted by regulatory changes. Of course, I mean, this is a very regulated, I mean, electricity is a very regulated market, and any change in regulation would have an impact in the, let's say, in the prices or in the cost we save when we don't buy electricity from the grid.
Okay, thank you very much.
And when this will be in place, we will analyze the impact. We will see how this has impacted essentially in the domestic or in the residential electricity tariffs.
Okay, good. Thank you. Another question, it's probably a suggestion. If an analysis could be made between poor regulatory incentives versus good regulatory incentives in each country, this may help bring an influence on the governments to improve their regulations. Any comment on this?
Our comment is that we agree. I mean, one of the readers of this study should be policymakers in each country. I mean, if they want their countries to rank in a better, or to be positioned in a better ranking or in a better position, then the regulation should be better, should be more favorable to PV, or for PV.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. So I think there are no additional questions for the time being. So we will probably adjourn in a few moments. Let's see, last question arriving at this moment. What about Canada case? So again, it's not covered in this study. I don't know whether you have some initial ingredients for this country.
No, not at all. We haven't looked at Canada.
Okay, good. Another question coming. Did you include the cost of the advanced infrastructure metering system to enable the regulatory frame?
No, we didn't. All we did was asking for the cost of the complete system. So if a installer requires any specific device, including a smart meter or something, to complete the PV system, then that would be included in the cost of in the capex, so in the initial investment. That is the only. I mean, we are not looking into. We are not making like a macroeconomic study about the electricity or grid development of a specific country and how to include or how to integrate PV in the electricity system of a country. I mean, this is. I think it would be a little bit out of. I mean, adjacent to what we're doing, but out of the scope of this study.
Okay, good. Very well. So if there are no additional questions, we will adjourn here. So thank you very much to the audience for being here and listening to the interesting presentation. Thank you, of course, to our speakers today. for the presentation of this very interesting study and tool. And now I will simply give the floor to the speakers to close the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to everybody. Thank you, Fernando.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Okay, thank you. Goodbye now.